Have you ever run your test suite, seen a test fail, made absolutely no changes to the code, and then run the exact same test again only to see it pass? If you've worked with software testing, you may have encountered this frustrating situation. These tests are called flaky tests. A flaky test is a test that can non-deterministically pass or fail even when we run it on the same version of the code. And this creates a serious problem for developers. But among the different types of flaky tests, there are two particularly important categories that are related to timing and concurrency. The first is async wait flakiness. Imagine that a test makes an asynchronous call to some service. The test then waits for the service to complete before checking the result. But what happens if the test only waits for, say, 5 seconds, while the service sometimes takes slightly longer? The test may pass when the service finishes quickly and fail when it takes longer. The second category is concurrency flakiness. Here, multiple threads are executing concurrently, and the result can depend on the order in which those threads happen to execute. One thread may execute before another during one test run, while the order is reversed during another run. And that difference in thread interleaving can cause the test to pass or fail. Interestingly, prior research found that these two categories, async wait and concurrency flaky tests, make up a large proportion of flaky tests. In fact, one study found that around 65% of the flaky tests it analyzed belonged to these two categories. So how do developers usually fix these problems? One very common approach is surprisingly simple. Just increase the wait time. This can reduce flaky failures, but it isn't really a reliable solution. First, developers don't necessarily know what the correct waiting time should be. Second, they may end up waiting much longer than necessary, making the entire test suite slower. And more importantly, increasing the wait time doesn't actually guarantee that the problem has been solved. A test that works on one machine might still fail on another machine where execution is slower. So instead of asking, "How long should we wait?" the researchers behind this paper ask a much more interesting question. Why are we waiting for a fixed amount of time in the first place? What if instead of waiting for an arbitrary amount of time, we could make one part of the program wait until another specific part of the program has actually executed? And that's the key idea behind FlakeSync. FlakeSync is a technique for automatically repairing async flaky tests by introducing synchronization into the test execution. The basic intuition is quite simple. Suppose there is some important piece of code that needs to execute before another piece of code can safely continue. FlakeSync identifies these two locations. The first is called the critical point. This is the part of the code that needs to execute early relative to some other concurrently executing code. The second is called the barrier point. This is the location that needs to wait until the critical point has been executed. Once these 2 points have been identified, FlakeSync modifies the program so that the barrier point waits for the critical point instead of simply waiting for an arbitrary amount of time. This introduces synchronization between the relevant parts of the execution. In this video, we're going to deconstruct this paper and understand exactly how FlakeSync works. So let's get started. Now that we understand the basic idea behind FlakeSync, let's look at a concrete example from the paper. This example comes from the Apache Incubator Uniful project and is particularly useful because it shows exactly why simply increasing the wait time is not a reliable way to repair an async flaky test. Let's break down what this test is doing. At the beginning, the test creates a gRPC metrics object. This object is then passed to a gRPC thread pool executor. The executor is responsible for creating and running tasks on different threads. So we now have a situation where the test thread and other worker threads are executing concurrently. When the test submits a task to the executor, a new thread starts executing. And before that thread actually executes the task, the executor's beforeExecute method is called. This is important because the beforeExecute method modifies the shared gRPC metrics object. So we have a shared object being modified by another thread. Now comes the problematic part. After submitting the task, the test tells the current thread to wait for 120 milliseconds. The assumption is that during those 120 milliseconds, the other thread will have enough time to execute the required computations and update the gRPC metrics object. After sleeping, the test reads values from gRPC metrics and performs assertions. And this is exactly where the flakiness comes from. What if the other thread doesn't finish its computation within those 120 milliseconds? Maybe the machine is busy. Maybe the operating system schedules the thread differently. Maybe the thread simply takes a little longer to execute. In that situation, the test wakes up after 120 milliseconds and immediately performs its assertions even though the other thread hasn't finished updating the shared object. The assertions can therefore fail. And if the other thread happens to finish within 120 milliseconds during the next run, the exact same test passes. That's a classic async wait flaky test. And there's an interesting detail here. The developers had actually already noticed that this test was flaky. Their previous attempt to fix it was to increase the waiting time. The original wait was 100 milliseconds. They increased it to 120 milliseconds, but the test was still flaky. And this demonstrates the fundamental problem with fixed waiting times. There is no universally correct value. So, what should the test actually do? The key insight behind FlakeSync is that instead of asking, "Has enough time passed?" we should ask, "Has the operation that I depend on actually finished?" In this example, the critical computation happens inside the before execute method. Specifically, this code modifies the shared gRPC metrics object. So FlakeSync identifies this section as the critical point. The test assertions, on the other hand, represent the point that needs to wait. This becomes the barrier point. The solution is therefore to introduce explicit synchronization between these 2 points. The paper does this by introducing a variable that records whether the critical computation has been executed. In the before execute method, after the important computations have completed, the variable is set to true. The test thread can then check this variable before proceeding to its assertions. Instead of blindly sleeping for 120 milliseconds, the test continuously waits until the critical computation has actually happened. And this is exactly the type of repair that FlakeSync is designed to automatically discover. It identifies the code that needs to execute first, the critical point, and the code that needs to wait, the barrier point. It then inserts the necessary synchronization between them. But how do we actually find these points? Let's start with critical search. Remember the intuition from our previous example. If the thread executing the critical code takes too long, the test fails. Therefore, if we deliberately introduce a sufficiently large delay before the critical code, we should be able to reproduce the flaky failure. And that's exactly the strategy used by critical search. There are 4 main stages. First, delay injection, then minimizing delay locations, after that root method search, and finally identifying the critical point. Let's go through each one. The first challenge is deciding where to inject delays. The researchers assume that the most relevant locations are likely to be associated with the concurrent methods. So critical search first identifies these concurrent methods. To do that, FlakeSync dynamically instruments the code under test. It places instrumentation at the entry and exit points of methods. Suppose execution enters method A. If method A hasn't reached its exit point yet, and execution then enters method B, this suggests that method A and method B are executing concurrently. So method A can be considered a concurrent method. The researchers run the flaky test 10 times and collect the concurrent methods observed across those executions. Next, it looks for all the locations where these concurrent methods are invoked. These become potential delay locations. It dynamically instruments the candidate locations and inserts something equivalent to thread.sleep delay before those locations. Initially, the delay is relatively small. It runs the test with these delays injected. If the test still passes, it doubles the delay. And this continues until one of 2 things happens. Either the test finally fails, or the maximum configured delay is reached. If the test never fails, even with the maximum delay, critical search cannot identify a critical point through this strategy. But if the test does fail, we now have a useful clue. We know that slowing down execution at some combination of these locations can reproduce the flaky failure. The next question is, which of these locations are actually responsible? At this point, critical search may have a large set of delay locations. But we don't want to synchronize dozens of unrelated locations. We want to find the smallest set of locations that can still reproduce the failure. For this, FlakeSync uses a technique called delta debugging. The basic idea behind delta debugging is simple. For example, imagine we initially have 8 possible delay locations. We could divide them into 2 groups. We then inject delays into one group at a time. If the first group still causes the test to fail, we know that we don't need the second group. We can then split the first group again and continue the process. Eventually, we might discover that only locations B and C are necessary. That's the basic idea of delta debugging. However, FlakeSync makes an important modification to this process. Remember that the failure may depend on the total amount of delay introduced into the execution. Suppose the test only becomes flaky when execution is slowed down by a total of 500 milliseconds. If we remove several delay locations, we may accidentally reduce the total delay and cause the test to start passing again. That doesn't necessarily mean the removed locations were essential. It might simply mean that we need a larger delay at the remaining locations. So, when critical search reduces the number of delay locations, it can also increase the delay amount at those remaining locations. The result is a much smaller set of delay locations that can still reproduce the flaky failure. And interestingly, the researchers found that critical search can often reduce this to a single delay location. But there's still a problem. Even if we find a single delay location, that location may not actually be the precise critical point. It could simply be one location inside a larger method. So, critical search performs another search. The next stage is called root method search. Let's understand this through an example. Let's assume method A calls method B, and method B calls method C, and finally method C contains our current delay location. If delaying method C causes the test to fail, critical search asks, what if we instead delay the call to method C from method B? If that still causes the failure, we move higher. Then we ask, what if we delay the call to method B from method A? If the test still fails, we can move even higher. Critical search keeps moving up the call stack until it finds the highest location where injecting a delay can still reproduce the failure. The researchers call this the root method. So the root method is essentially the highest method in the call stack, where slowing down execution can still produce the flaky failure. Why is this useful? Because it gives critical search a more meaningful region of code to search when trying to identify the exact critical point. Once the root methods have been identified, critical search moves to the final stage. The final question is, where exactly inside this method is the critical point? Critical search starts at the beginning of the root method and moves through the method line by line. At each location, it injects a delay and runs the test. Initially, the test passes. Then, eventually, it reaches a location where injecting the delay causes the test to fail. This tells us that we've entered the important region. Critical search continues searching to identify where the behavior changes again from failure back to passing. The final location where the injected delay still produces the failure becomes the critical point. Let's connect this back to the gRPC server test example we saw earlier. Remember that the worker thread modifies the shared gRPC metrics object. The important computations happen inside the before execute method. Critical search can experiment with delays around this code. Eventually, it identifies the relevant region and determines that the critical point is line 32. Because after this line, all the important computations that modify the shared metrics data have completed. That means this is the point after which the test can safely proceed with its assertions as long as the test thread waits until execution reaches this point. In the next part, we'll look at barrier search and see how FlakeSync finds the corresponding barrier point and turns these two locations into an actual repair. Let's go through the process step by step. For every critical point identified by critical search, barrier search first needs to understand where the flaky failure actually occurs. So it runs the test again, but this time it deliberately injects the delay at the critical point. Because critical search has already established that delaying the critical point can reproduce the flaky failure. By doing this, barrier search can observe the resulting failure. And in Java, particularly when we're working with JUnit tests, a failure typically results in an exception being thrown. That exception contains something extremely useful, a call stack. The call stack tells us where the exception occurred and the sequence of method calls that led to that location. And barrier search uses this call stack as a roadmap for searching for the barrier point. Imagine the exception occurs somewhere inside the test. Barrier search starts at the location where the exception was thrown. It then searches backward through the code. The basic question it asks at each potential location is, if we make execution wait here until the critical point has been executed, does the test now pass? This is a very important idea. Barrier search doesn't need to understand the entire program semantically. Instead, it tries possible synchronization locations and observes the result. For each candidate location, barrier search modifies the test by inserting a loop that repeatedly calls thread.yield. Now, barrier search checks the result. If the test passes, we've found our barrier point. If the test still fails, or if it times out, barrier search moves to another location. And it continues this process until it finds a location that successfully repairs the failure. Let's return to the example. We already know that the critical point was identified inside before execute, but the test itself performs the assertions after the executor submits the task. So, barrier search examines the failure and searches backward through the test execution. Eventually, it identifies the location before the assertions where the test should wait. That's where FlakeSync can insert the synchronization loop. Now, let's see another subtle problem that the authors have to handle. Imagine that a critical point is inside a method that executes multiple times. FlakeSync, therefore, has an additional mechanism for handling multiple executions of a critical point. If barrier search cannot find a suitable barrier point while assuming that the critical point only needs to execute once, it performs another step. It runs the test normally, without injecting delays, and counts how many times the critical point is executed during a passing test execution. Let's say the critical point normally executes 4 times before the test passes. FlakeSync can use 4 as the execution threshold. Now, the synchronization condition becomes something like, don't proceed until the critical point has executed 4 times. This prevents the barrier from being released too early. Barrier search then repeats its search using this execution threshold. If the test passes, we've successfully identified a barrier point that synchronizes with the required number of critical point executions. But if the test still fails, even after trying the relevant locations and execution threshold, then FlakeSync considers the repair unsuccessful for that critical point. Now, coming back to the example again, it illustrates a repaired Flaky test. FlakeSync introduces a field on line 33 to keep track of when the critical point has been executed, and FlakeSync introduces a loop to wait until the critical point is executed at the barrier point on lines 10 to 12. FlakeSync doesn't simply modify the test based on intuition. It dynamically applies these transformations while the test is running. Once FlakeSync has confirmed that the synchronization works, the developer can use the same information to create a permanent patch in the source code. However, there is an important limitation. For a developer to directly apply the generated synchronization changes to their source code, both the critical point and the barrier point need to be located in code that the developer controls. Why? Because developers generally cannot, or should not, modify third-party library code. Imagine that the critical point identified by FlakeSync exists inside some external Java library. A developer using that library can't simply go into the library's source code and add a has executed flag. And even if they technically could modify the library, that might not be desirable. Remember, the synchronization we're introducing is designed to fix a specific Flaky test. Changing a general-purpose library could affect many other projects and applications that use that library. In such situations, FlakeSync can instead be used as a runtime environment. Rather than permanently modifying the third-party library, FlakeSync can dynamically instrument the code during the test execution and introduce the synchronization between the critical point and barrier point. This allows the developer to benefit from the repair without modifying general-purpose library code. Now the next question is, how do we actually evaluate whether FlakeSync works? To answer this, the researchers designed a series of experiments around 5 research questions. First, how many async Flaky tests can FlakeSync repair? Second, what are the characteristics of the repaired tests? Third, what is the runtime cost of running FlakeSync? Fourth, how much runtime overhead does the repaired test introduce? And finally, what are developers' reactions to the patches proposed by FlakeSync? For their evaluation, the researchers used an international dataset of Flaky tests. The dataset contains Flaky tests collected from open-source Maven projects hosted on GitHub. The tests are categorized according to the techniques that were used to detect them. 2 particularly important categories are order-dependent Flaky tests and non-order-dependent Flaky tests. The distinction is based on whether the outcome of a test depends on the order in which tests are executed. This distinction is important because FlakeSync is specifically designed to address asynchronous and concurrency-related timing problems. It is therefore unlikely to be useful for order-dependent flaky tests. So the researchers start by focusing on the 300 non-order dependent flaky tests in the dataset. But they don't immediately run FlakeSync on all 300. They first need to make sure that the projects and tests can actually be built and executed. For each NOD test, they attempt to build and run it at the specific commit where the flaky test was originally detected. After filtering out the tests that did not build, the researchers are left with 221 tests. But there's still another filtering step. Researchers run each test individually and check whether any concurrent methods are actually executed during the test. If a test doesn't have any concurrent methods, then it is unlikely to be an async flaky test that FlakeSync can repair. Those tests are therefore removed as well. After this filtering process, the final evaluation dataset contains 176 flaky tests from 23 open-source Maven projects and 37 modules. The researchers also report several characteristics of these projects and tests. Now let's talk about the actual experimental setup. To perform its dynamic instrumentation, FlakeSync uses ASM, a Java bytecode manipulation and analysis framework. ASM allows FlakeSync to modify the program during execution. For example, it can inject delays into specific locations and introduce the synchronization logic between the critical and barrier points. Next, FlakeSync is allowed to spend up to 12 hours searching for a repair for an individual test. Once FlakeSync produces a repair, the researchers run the repaired test 100 times. Also, the initial delay used by crit search is set to 100 milliseconds, and the maximum delay is set to 51,200 milliseconds. And finally, for barrier search, each individual search attempt has a timeout of 3 minutes. Note that the researchers use a Ubuntu 20.04 Docker container, configured with 4 CPUs and 4 GB of RAM. This gives the experiments a consistent environment and makes the runtime measurements more meaningful. So, what is the answer to our first research question? Out of the 176 tests in the dataset, FlakeSync successfully repaired 67. That corresponds to 38.5% of all flaky tests in the evaluation dataset. At first glance, you might look at that number and think, only 38.5%? That doesn't sound particularly impressive. But there's an important reason why this isn't the right way to interpret the result. FlakeSync was specifically designed to repair async flaky tests. It wasn't designed to repair every possible type of flaky test. So the researchers manually inspected the remaining tests to determine which ones were actually async flaky tests, and they found that out of 176, only 80 were async flaky tests. Now, the answer to our first research question becomes, FlakeSync successfully repairs 67 out of 80 async flaky tests, giving it a repair rate of 83.75%. Now let's answer our second research question. Out of the 67 async flaky tests that FlakeSync repaired, 61 can be repaired with changes that can be directly applied to the project's own source code. Only 6 tests have their critical point in third-party library code. And although 31 tests initially have their barrier point identified inside third-party library code, restricting barrier search to project code allows 61 of the 67 tests to have both synchronization points within developer-controlled code. Researchers also find that 60 out of 67 tests only require the barrier to wait for a single execution of the critical point. Only 7 tests require multiple executions, with an average requirement of 3.19 executions. So, overall, the repairs produced by FlakeSync are not only effective, they are also generally practical for developers to apply. Now, let's look at the answer to our third research question. The researchers find that FlakeSync on average takes 126.62 minutes per async flaky test, with a median runtime of 58.77 minutes. For tests that FlakeSync successfully repairs, the average runtime is 103.52 minutes. The majority of this cost comes from critical search, which takes an average of 104.39 minutes, compared with 22.23 minutes for barrier search. So yes, FlakeSync is computationally expensive, but it's important to remember what we're paying for. We're not paying this cost every time the test runs. We're paying it during an automated one-time search for a permanent repair. And if that repair eliminates a flaky test that developers might otherwise repeatedly investigate, rerun, and debug, the upfront cost can potentially be worthwhile. Moving on to the answer to our fourth research question. The average overhead is 2.26 times, but this number is influenced by a few tests with particularly high overhead. The much more representative median overhead is just 1. That means FlakeSync can eliminate a significant amount of async flakiness without substantially slowing down most tests. Let's answer our final research question. The researchers submitted 10 pull requests to 10 open source projects. Out of these, 3 pull requests had already been accepted. The remaining pull requests were still pending. And importantly, none had been rejected. The feedback from the accepted pull requests was also encouraging. Developers recognized that synchronization-based repairs could eliminate unnecessary hard-coded sleep durations. Before we conclude the paper, it's important to talk about the limitations of FlakeSync. To summarize, FlakeSync has several important limitations. First, it only targets async flaky tests. Next, it cannot currently distinguish flakiness from genuine concurrency bugs. Also, it requires the flaky failure to be reproducible through delay injection. Next, it currently focuses on multi-threading within a single JVM. Also, it cannot repair flakiness caused purely by absolute timing constraints. Next, it cannot currently handle cases requiring multiple critical points to be synchronized simultaneously. Finally, it cannot always generate a directly applicable source code patch when synchronization points are inside third-party libraries. These limitations don't necessarily invalidate the approach. Instead, they help define the boundary of what FlakeSync can currently do. And importantly, many of these limitations point directly toward interesting areas for future research. And with that, we've reached the end of the paper. If you'd like to dive deeper into the technical details, I highly recommend reading the original research paper. I've included the link in the description below. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.